Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Sunday mornings at the Marxist Library. A quick reminder before we start, this session is being recorded. The video of the session will be available both on our YouTube channel at Icss Marxist and on our website, icssmarx.org, within the next couple of days. This session is being hosted by the ICSS, which stands for the Institute for the Critical Study of Society. And we're a group of volunteers who organize these meetings every Sunday to discuss politics, environmental issues, war, militarism, imperialism, class struggle, you name it, from a Marxist perspective. Our talk, one of the things that we do before we begin is we're generally hosted in Oakland, California at the Nebel Proctor Marxist Library. During the pandemic, though, we've been continuing our meetings online via Zoom, which has actually allowed us to open up our sessions to the entire world. At some point, we hope to resume our meetings at the Oakland Nebel Proctor Library, but we plan to continue our Zoom sessions as well. So I would like to, in addition to saying good morning, say good afternoon and good evening for those of you who are joining us from throughout the world. Today's meeting, we're going to go for about an hour for presentation from our speaker, and followed by a short break with announcements and a fundraising appeal, followed by a question and answer period of about an hour. Taking questions from the audience. We ask people to limit your questions or comments from the audience to about 2 minutes each to get everybody a chance to contribute. And
there he is.
Your questions focused on the topic at hand. If you have any questions about the Nebel Proctor Library and the ICS Sunday morning sessions, you can reach us directly through our website at icssmarx.org. You can send us an email on the contact form.
Yeah.
Today's session, let me just get
got another pair of exactly.
Please mute everybody.
Yeah, we're working on it. Okay, Raj, if you would unmute Max, I'd appreciate that. Okay. All right, so we're going to have our presentation by Max, and let me give you a quick introduction to him. Max's talk today is titled NATO's Useful Idiots, How the Left's Mislabeling of the Russian Military Operation aids Western imperialism. And Max Parry is an independent journalist. His work has appeared on RT, Sputnik, and most recently, we found out about him from an article that he published on Covert Action on basically the history of the national question, sort of analyzing Putin's speech in February about what's going on in Ukraine. We're really excited to have Max present to us today. Max, if you want to go ahead and take over from here, please go ahead.
Thank you, Alan. First of all, I just want to thank Alan and everyone at ICSS and the Marxist Library for giving me the opportunity to speak today. I also want to thank Alan for assisting me with this presentation, passing me along some really great resources to help me. So I want to give Alan some credit because I did find a lot of use for them. And it's a real honor and a great opportunity to speak to you all today as a up and coming journalist. And when Alan first contacted me, like I was telling you before we started, I was really excited to hear that my article in Covert Action had been the subject of debate among your group and discussion, whether you agreed with me or didn't agree with me. When I wrote that article, I really hoped that ideally it would start such a debate or discussion. So to actually get such an invitation like this one is really gratifying, because I think the left's response to Ukraine is a really desperately needed discourse and dialogue that needs to be had. There's, in my view, been so much of a echo chamber and so much uniformity and groupthink towards a geopolitical conflict that, no matter what your opinion of it is, whether you agreed with the article I wrote or not, I think everyone can acknowledge that it's an extremely complex conflict, and it's driven by very complicated historical processes. And I think if you look at the left's response in general, there's been a pretty homogenous response, and so I think it's and we've also seen a really unprecedented wave of deplatforming and censorship on social media platforms, and the targeting of alternative media and independent outlets. I mean, I'm sure if you did a Google search for the Icss, you're not going to be the top result in terms of information about Ukraine. So, this is really affecting, the left's ability to be a dissenting voice against, the mainstream narrative. And of course, we saw the banning of RT, the shutdown of RT America, where any semblance of what used to be called the fairness doctrine, where alternative viewpoints or the other side of the conflict is just completely missing. Americans are only getting one narrative about the conflict and why it's happening, what's happening on the ground. Americans are, Westerners are just simply not allowed to hear any alternative perspective, whether it's the Russian side or any anti-imperialist view, certainly. And in my view, even when you look at the periphery, the political periphery that the left wing, the space that it occupies, in many instances, it's not even really diverging from the mainstream narrative, which is part of what gave me the impetus to write the article I wrote for CAM. And I think that the left has really missed an opportunity to connect not just the Ukraine crisis, but Western foreign policy in general with the repercussions that Americans and the working class in the West, which, the working class that lives in the imperial core, the consequences that the repercussions of this, that they're feeling. I don't have to tell you, you're all, most of you, I'm assuming, are out there in California, where gas prices, I'm hearing, are reaching $10 per gallon. There's nationwide inflation, rising cost of living, deepening inequality, and this is all being connected to the Ukraine crisis. Of course, the Biden regime is blaming it all on Russia and its decision to launch this military operation, but I think many of you would agree with me that it probably has a lot more to do with the sanctions that have been placed on Russia. But if you look at the left's response to this crisis, it's really missed an opportunity to connect those things, the plight of workers in the United States and Western Europe, with the disastrous Western foreign policy and the expansion of NATO, and in many cases, it's largely jumped on the anti-Russian bandwagon. So I think it's very important to get to the bottom of this issue and sort out these disagreements among the left that it has on Ukraine. And so I'm really grateful to the ICSS for inviting me to speak today. I'm hoping that this discussion leads to greater insight and further dialogue, even if it's starting out in a small group of 20 people, that it continues and expands on. Before I dive into the heart of my presentation, I wanted to just sort of summarize the main points I'm going to try to cover just to keep things organized. First, I want to begin by giving an example or two of some prominent takes I've seen by individual commentators and left-wing organizations that I think represent a few different tendencies within the left in its response to the Ukraine crisis. And then after I give those examples, I'm going to go into historically the definition of imperialism, the way the left has been using the term, or in many cases, in my belief, misusing the term, misapplying it, versus the Marxist definition of imperialism as written by Lenin. And then I'm going to follow that by giving some examples of actual imperialism and juxtapose that with why I do not believe Russia's military operation in Ukraine does not qualify as an imperialist war. And finally, I'm going to try and explain why I feel these incorrect stances on the left characterizing the Russian operation as imperialism, even when these organizations or political commentators denounce NATO, denounce the United States, even when they denounce both Russia and NATO, they are tacitly lending support to the narrative that NATO is using to use Ukraine as a cat's paw for imperialism against Russia. So that's sort of how I'm going to proceed here in my presentation. I hope that was clear. And before I give some examples, I just want to get out of the way that we all know what the liberal left's response has been, which has been to excessively demonize Russia. I'm not going to bother to really even address that. That's not on the agenda today. I'm interested in addressing the positions of actual left-wing organizations. And when I say the left, I mean the many different groups which self-identify as socialist or Marxist or communist. That's what I'm addressing. I'm not here to talk about the blue check MSDNC left. And I think if one does a survey of these organizations, I believe there are a few different camps that I've identified, and Alan was actually very helpful in sending some examples along to me. A few different camps which vary in their condemnation of Russia. Some mostly condemn NATO and also make sure to criticize Moscow's actions, and others see the expansion of NATO and Russia as twin evils. I think when Alan and I were discussing it, he used the term the two imperialisms camp, or what they call the Ukraine crisis as inter-imperial rivalry or inter-imperial competition in Ukraine as a proxy war between Washington and Moscow. And then there's a few groups, namely, I guess you could say Code Pink or the Answer Coalition affiliated parties, PSL, Workers' World, which mostly condemn NATO, but then include the qualification that Russia is to be condemned for its invasion. However, I think despite the differences between the two imperialisms camp versus the the latter. I think despite their differences in however much they may blame NATO versus Russia, whether it's equal share of blame or mostly the former, I think the end result is the same, and that is to lend de facto support for the narrative that NATO is using to demonize Russia and push it to the geopolitical periphery. But before I address the groups which mostly blame or fault NATO for the expansion of the war, before I address them, I want to start with the two imperialisms camp, which does see the conflict as a proxy war, but one in which both the US or NATO and Russia are trying to conquer Ukraine. One writer that Alan brought to my attention, who I think really epitomizes this two imperialisms position. I have to admit, I hadn't heard of him until Alan passed him along to me. And actually, also, I read an article by the military analyst, the Saker, addressing him, who I'm sure you all know. And I'm talking about Greg Godels, who writes for Marxism-Leninism Today. He really exemplifies this two imperialisms position, and he wrote an article entitled, "Is Russia an imperialist country? That's not the right question to ask." He wrote this back in April. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with this piece, but in it, he equates Imperial Russia under the Tsar with what he refers to as Putin's Russia, which he concedes in his description is a relatively weak capitalist country, or as he describes it, a quote, stunted industrial capitalist economy, but with enormous essential resources. So Godels acknowledges that post-Soviet Russia is indeed a relatively weak capitalist state. But then he goes on to say that it still has the quote, capacity to participate in great power activity, to enlarge and protect spheres of influence, and to confront other great powers. In this case, the other great power would obviously be the United States, which, NATO is really dominated by the United States. I'm sure we can all agree about that. So here he's illustrating this two imperialisms camp. And if you watch a recent interview Godels did with the Real News Network, he continues this line of thought. He also states in his article that to deny Russia would fall within Lenin's 5 essential features of imperialism would be, quote, sheer sophistry. Now, if any of you have read Lenin's Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, in that work, he provides 5 essential features, which many Marxists today, like Godels, routinely, in my view, without much thought, use as a point of reference or a boilerplate to sort of mechanically determine whether or not a country qualifies as imperialist. And the problem I have with Godels' analysis, I think, typifies a problem with many self-professed Marxists today, in that they are not being, they may be Marxist in name, but they are not being Marxist in their application. In this instance with Ukraine, in that they are not trying to understand the particulars of their own present historical and geographical moment. Instead of drawing from Marxism as a scientific method that Marx and Engels developed to apply to the present geopolitical world, and instead their characterization of the conflict between NATO and Russia, as they call it, an inter-imperial rivalry, their argument is entirely molded on the inter-imperial competition of Lenin's era, of the early 20th century. And the problem I have with that is that their understanding of Lenin's definition of imperialism is entirely based on the one that he wrote about in Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, which was written during World War I, and specifically in a context in which the Bolsheviks were specifically trying to mobilize the working classes of Europe within the imperial core to use the widespread discontent over World War I as an opportunity to mobilize and to overthrow, to lead socialist revolutions and overthrow the ruling classes in their respective countries. So they're plucking something, they're ripping it out of context, this definition that Lenin gave in Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, from the period of World War I, and they use it as, writers like Gödel's, they use it as a boilerplate to apply to any geopolitical conflict today. And in addition to that, the understanding that they have is entirely incomplete, because the definition that Lenin gave in Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, is only one instance or one definition that Lenin gave. He in other works that he wrote, including his later writings, he expanded upon the definition of imperialism. He gave it greater detail and reconceptualized. He redefined imperialism in a national character. He whereas the definition that's in Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, is very much a definition of imperialism that is economically based, describing it as economic stage of capitalism, monopoly capitalism. So I think that Gödel's and others, when they say that the Russian military operation in Ukraine is imperialist, using the 5 essential features that Lenin gave in Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, their understanding is missing not only context, but it's an entirely incomplete understanding of Lenin's definition. And Gödel's, in his essay, begins by stating that Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, is, quote, the leading elaboration of the concept of imperialism for Marxists. It's a starting point for any discussion of the global dynamics of capitalism from the late 19th century until today. So he's making very clear this is where he's getting his definition. And I don't mean to take away for the importance of that work. There's no doubt that it is one of the most important works for any Marxist to understand imperialism. But that's not the only definition Lenin provided in his work, and actually in his other writings, as I said, expanded upon the Marxist conception, which was quite distinct, by the way, from the classical or traditional pre-industrial definition of imperialism. Sorry, just give me 1 second. Lenin actually gave, in my view, Lenin actually gave a much more clear and concise definition that's very useful in another very important work that I'm not sure Gödel's is aware of, which is an essay that I would encourage everyone here to read. It's up on Marxist.org, and it's called Imperialism and the Split in Socialism, where he was addressing Karl Kautsky and the Second International. As I'm sure many of you know, Kautsky was the head of the German Social Democratic Party of Germany, which which betrayed the working class, voting for war credits for Germany to enter the First World War. But anyway, in this essay, Imperialism and the Split in Socialism, which I would encourage everyone to look up, Lenin gives a very clear and concise definition of imperialism. And if you don't mind, I'd like to read from that, just one paragraph. Lenin says, we have to begin with as precise and full a definition of imperialism as possible. Imperialism is a specific historical stage of capitalism. Its specific character is threefold. Imperialism is monopoly capitalism, parasitic or decaying capitalism, moribund capitalism. The supplanting of free competition by monopoly is the fundamental economic feature, the quintessence of imperialism. Monopoly manifests itself in 5 principal forms: cartels, syndicates, and trusts. The concentration of production has reached a degree which gives rise to these monopolistic associations of capitalists. 2, the monopolistic position of the big banks. 3, 4, 5 giant banks manipulate the whole economic life of America, France, and Germany. Seizure of sources of raw materials by trusts and the financial oligarchy. Financial capital is monopoly industrial capital merged with bank capital. And 4, the economic partition of the world by the international cartels has begun. So Lenin and imperialism and the split in socialism makes clear that imperialism is not a policy. It's not simply when one country sends troops into another country. And it's also contrary to what some might assume is not necessarily the same thing as colonialism. Imperialism is an economic system, according to the Marxist definition, a system where capitalism has reached its monopoly stage. He's defining imperialism as the export of capital, which he also did in Imperialism, the Highest Stage, where, it used to be that countries exported products, but now they, in imperialism, export capital or corporations based in Western countries across the world and dominate the economies of other countries, exporting not products, but their enterprise, monopolizing the markets of other countries. And specifically where countries around the world in the developing world or the global south are kept poor, so that the city of London or Wall Street, when he was writing at the time, can stay rich, and where finance capital becomes dominant over industrial capital, where bankers begin to dominate the world and carve out spheres of influence, or as he calls it, trusts, cartels, and syndicates. Monopoly capitalism, where a concentrated few trusts, cartels, and syndicates dominate the economies of entire countries, and their tentacles permeate across the planet, keeping poorer nations from developing. And this is its highest stage. This is capitalism highest stage. So it's not, imperialism is not simply when one country conducts a military operation in another country and sends troops into another country. That is not the definition of imperialism. Whenever a country sends troops into another country, that does not necessarily mean that it's imperialism. And let's see here. Imperialism, he also defines as the centralization of capital, where finance capital begins to dominate industrial capital. And when the imperialism is when these capitalist countries have reached such a stage that they're overflowing with capital, and that overflow pushes them towards expansionism, where they begin to acquire territories by force, to export that surplus capital, and to acquire cheaper labor power and raw materials to extract from other countries abroad. And in an inter-imperial rivalry, you see authors like Gödel's refer to the conflict between NATO and Russia as an inter-imperial rivalry. Well, how does Lenin define that? It's when these states clash with each other, leading to world war, which is what Lenin wrote about in Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. And again, this is missing context. When Lenin wrote about an inter-imperial rivalry, he was referring to World War I, when he was trying to mobilize the proletariat of Europe and within the imperial powers, who were being used as cannon fodder to fight each other, to see that the surplus of capital being exported abroad for the purposes of increasing profits for the ruling class, not for the good of the working classes within these imperial countries, that it was not in their interest, and it was in their interest to rise up in socialist revolutions and overthrow these ruling classes that were sending them to their deaths, whether it was the Tsar or the Kaiser. And also the reason that he also lays out how these countries were doing this, because they had reached a stage of capitalism where, in order to resolve the inherent contradiction of the problem of overproduction, as Marx wrote about it, the recession and stagnation from underconsumption, or the problem of overproduction that Marx wrote about, they were exporting capital to acquire the resources of other countries in order to resolve the problem of underconsumption within the imperial core, and that it was in the interest of workers to join and to rise up in socialist revolutions to overthrow the capitalist classes. And so I think that additional definition that Lenin provides in that work helps clarify that imperialism, according to the Marxist definition that Lenin wrote about, imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, that's one economic definition. There was other instances where Lenin expanded upon that definition, and he makes clear in this work, Imperialism and the Split in Socialism, that imperialism is not a policy. It's not simply when one country sends troops into another country. It's an economic system. It's a stage of capitalism. And there's also, that brings me to my next point, which is another work I'd like to look at by Lenin. And the reason I brought that up is because the definition of imperialism that most are familiar with is the economic one that's written about in those two preceding works I mentioned. But I think that it's vital to understand that in addition to the economic or class-based explanation Lenin gave for imperialism, which he wrote about in the context of the First World War, he later updated. And authors like Greg Gödel are cherry-picking quotes from Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, to support their argument that Russia is conducting imperialism by conducting this military operation in Ukraine. But I think that the context in which it was, as I said, in which imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, was written is very important, because Lenin later updated his definition in 1920 when he gave a speech to the Comintern, the Second Congress of the Communist International in 1920. And he reconceptualized or redefined imperialism, not just in an economic definition like that was given in his previous work, but in this speech, he gave it a national character, a national definition. And I think that this speech, which is also available on Marxist.org, by the way, it's from July 1920. It's a speech to the Comintern. He redefined imperialism, categorizing the world into oppressor and oppressed nations. In other words, he reformulated or reconceptualized imperialism as a division of the world into two camps where exploitation was not just occurring on an economic level through the export of capital or through warfare, but as nations exploiting other nations in times of peace as well. So the context in which he gave this speech is really important because remember, it's written in 1920. This is after World War I has ended. The Russian Revolution has already happened. And a simple way of differentiating the two definitions I think Lenin has of imperialism is imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, refers to class exploitation, while his speech to the Second Congress of the Communist International reconceives imperialism as national exploitation. And in this speech, he's very clear which nations constitute the oppressed distinction and which nations consist of the oppressor distinction. And he is very clear that the oppressed distinction consists of the nations of the global south, of the developing world, of Asia, Africa, and Latin America that were colonized, obviously for the purpose of looting their wealth and resources. And in the third section of this speech, I'm sorry, I didn't give the title of it. This section is called the Report on the Commission of the National and the Colonial Questions, where he says the characteristic feature of imperialism consists in the whole world, as we now see, being divided into a large number of oppressed nations and an insignificant number of oppressor nations, the latter possessing colonial wealth and powerful armed forces. The vast majority of the world's population, if we take the total population of the world as 1,750 million, and in other words, about 70% of the world's population belong to the oppressed nations. And so, in other words, I think that the definition that of imperialism that Gödel's and others have used is truncated. And I think this is why many left-wing organizations today have failed to understand a conflict like the Ukraine crisis, or also similarly the Syrian war, or the role of Iran and the axis of resistance in the fight against Western imperialism, and so on and so forth. But now with Ukraine, we're even seeing many who seemingly, I felt, did grasp imperialism in its present form, suddenly echoing mainstream talking points. And that brings me to the second camp, which I would consist of not Gödel's, but more the responses I've seen by PSL and Workers' World, Code Pink, the Answer Coalition. If you read their statements, they mostly condemn NATO, but then they make sure to qualify that they condemn the invasion. And I think that this is a trap that a lot of the left has fallen into, where they think they can, I guess, gain credibility or bourgeois respectability, where they think they can get away with criticizing Western foreign policy if they make sure to qualify it with a denunciation of Russia or Putin, if they just go along with repeating a few of the mainstream talking points, that Russia's invading Ukraine to conquer it or to overthrow Zelensky. I even saw, I was very shocked when I saw the talk given by Abby Martin and with Brian Becker, two people I have a tremendous amount of respect for, who are usually on the ball. But they even in the talk they gave shortly after the military operation began and the conflict escalated, they even referred to it as a regime change war. And I'm not aware of any attempts by Russia to overthrow Zelensky. And I think as this conflict goes on, we're probably going to see, these people start to change their position, or at least I would hope so, because it seems pretty clear to me that what's going on is not a regime change war. The fact that it's lasted as long as it has, I think the only reason it's gone on as long as it has is because obviously the United States and NATO are pouring arms, an unlimited flow of arms into Ukraine while neglecting, to do anything to repair the crumbling infrastructure here at home, or repair the broken, our broken economy. And so this is very disturbing to me because, this is an opportunity when the left could be connecting, domestic issues and with U.S. foreign policy. And instead, what are they doing? They're playing this both sides. They're criticizing, yes, they're criticizing NATO expansion, but they're making sure to characterize what Russia is doing, which, in my view, is a defensive war. They've made clear that they're only interested in protecting the people of Donbass, who for 8 years have suffered relentless bombardment by the Ukrainian regime, where even according to UN statistics, 15,000 mostly Russian-speaking people in Donetsk and Luhansk have died. And Russia has not attempted to take any further territory or conduct regime change at all in Ukraine. This is simply about, a line had been drawn in the sand where Ukraine was talking about not only joining NATO, but which would mean the placement of missile systems right on Russia's border, but also, Zelensky, according to the State Duma, Zelensky had finally made a decision about seeking to acquire nuclear weapons. So to characterize what Russia is doing as imperialism, or even to condemn it as an invasion, as as PSL and Workers' World have, which I was very disappointed to see, because these are organizations I really respect and, usually are on the ball. I'm not a member myself, but when I see just across the left, whether it's, this is the time when the left should be taking a position that's distinct from much of the liberal left. I mean, there shouldn't be overlap between the far left and an organization like the DSA, which, despite the fact that it's international committee condemned NATO imperialist expansion, its candidates, its elected representatives in Congress voted, no questions asked, $40 billion to Ukraine, unlimited supply of weapons. So this has real life repercussions when the left is not doing enough to counter the narrative that's being put out there that Russia is an aggressor, or that Russia is somehow, as Gödels or one other writer I greatly admire, I used to greatly admire, Stephen Gowans, who has published some great work on Syria. He's totally dropped the ball on this issue. And, I would put him in the two imperialisms camp as well, where he's, characterized it as Russian imperialism in Ukraine, that they're trying to, do the same thing that NATO is, even though NATO is expanded to 15 countries in complete defiance of the agreement that Gorbachev and the George H.W. Bush administration had, that it would not expand 1 inch eastward. It's expanded to 15 countries. I just don't understand how any credible left-wing organization could be taking these kinds of positions. That's not to say that there isn't that Putin is ideal or anything like that, but as I wrote about in my article in Covert Action, that the decision, contrary to the way it's been portrayed, the Kremlin for the last 8 years has not actually supported the Donetsk or Luhansk separatists. They have not supported the Novo-Russian republics. They did not acknowledge their sovereignty until February. For 8 years, the Kremlin did not move on this. And who was it that introduced legislation to recognize the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics? It was the Communist Party of the Russian Federation, the biggest political opposition to Putin's united Russia. Putin did not agree for 8 years with the decision, did not agree to recognize the secession of the DPR and the LPR. They did, in the Minsk agreements, stipulate that the separatist territories, the Eastern Ukrainian Republic, should have some degree of autonomy. But of course, Kiev refused to implement those agreements, and which is why the war is broken out now. But the Kremlin did not recognize the DPR or the LPR until this was introduced in February by the Communist Party. Why is the left failing to recognize this? Why is the left making this a Russian war of aggression when Putin is actually doing this for his own political survival, because his political opposition is who introduced the move for the State Duma and the Kremlin to recognize the independence of these Russian-speaking separatists who, the inhabitants of Eastern Ukraine for the last 8 years have not only been subjected to 8 years of bombing, but they've been, the constitution of Ukraine is not properly federalist. Russian has been removed as a second official language. There's been a mass campaign under the last 2 Ukrainian presidents, removing all traces of Soviet culture in what they call decommunization laws. These people are being discriminated against. They want to secede from Ukraine because the Kiev regime is hostile towards them, both militarily and on every other level. There is a campaign of what I believe can only be described as ethnic cleansing, or as Putin called it in his speech, genocide. And I think that the term is applicable when you consider that 15,000 people have been killed by the Ukrainian armed forces, and when you consider that all traces of Soviet culture are being torn down and replaced with monuments and statues and street names honoring the Nazi collaborators who killed millions of or hundreds of thousands of Slavs, Jews, Romani people. So I think it's very, very important. This has so much importance that the left get this right. And to be playing both sides on an issue like this simply because Putin is a social conservative, or yes, he presides over yes, post-Soviet Russia is a capitalist country, but when you consider the fact that why did Putin fall out of favor with the United States? It's because he did do some relatively progressive things, despite whatever anyone wants to say about his domestic policies in terms of his relationship with the Orthodox Church or social conservatism or treatment of the Russian LGBT community. If you look at the reasons why he fell out of favor, it's because he nationalized, renationalized the energy sector. The oil and gas industry there is now state-run. Many of the oligarchs that looted the former state-owned property in Russia have since fled because they were being prosecuted. Yes, Putin has a relationship with some of the oligarchy. There's no doubt about that. There's definitely corruption. But when you look at the fact that during the 1990s, the life expectancy for the average Russian male was reduced by a full decade because of the neoliberal shock therapy and extreme free market policies that were forced upon the former Soviet Union. That level of neocolonialism through finance, Western capital, Putin has largely lowered that. The standard of living has gone up. The life expectancy has returned to what it once was. Yes, there remains massive inequality in Russia. I'm not denying that, but there are some progressive things that have gone on under Putin. And if you look at the way that in Russia, the geopolitical space that it occupies, in alliance with the pink tide in Latin America, in coming to the aid of the Syrian government when Syria was being used as a proxy in the proxy war, where the United States and its allies were supporting jihadist terrorist groups. What's going on in Ukraine is very similar. The sovereign governments in the Donetsk and Luhansk have been appealing to the Kremlin for 8 years for aid, for military aid. For 8 years, Russia denied doing it until finally the Communist Party of the Russian Federation put political pressure on him to recognize the two republics. As for the military operation, we can have a debate about the level of severity of it, whether Russia had alternatives. I certainly don't like to see, no one likes to see war, but my position has been since the conflict escalated in February, I challenge anyone to present what other options did Russia have but to launch this operation. I failed to see any because they had gone to the UN explaining, laying out in detail the war crimes by the Azov battalion and the many other, by the Ukrainian armed forces and the many other neo-Nazi militias in its ranks. They had exhausted all options with the international community and the United Nations. So I'm certainly open to hearing what other options Russia had and why its decision to launch an invasion or intervention should be condemned. I'm certainly open to hearing that, but I failed to see what other options Russia had, and I certainly don't see how this operation constitutes imperialism. And I think the reason that what I called the two imperialisms camp misunderstands the Russian operation as imperialism is because they're taking a very truncated and incomplete version or definition of imperialism from one specific work by Lenin, and they are not seeing the full context, their definition is incomplete. And that's why I brought up those two other works by Lenin, both the speech in 1920 he gave to the Comintern, and also Imperialism and the Split in Socialism, when he went into further detail about the economic definition of imperialism. I think that that's the reason why Gödel's and other analysts and other political organizations, like, as Alan passed along to me, the Communist Party of Greece, the KKE, have also taken a similar position to Gödel's, that what Russia's doing in Ukraine constitutes imperialism. I think that they have an incomplete understanding of Lenin's definition, and they need to revisit Lenin and his other works. But of course, I'm fully open to hearing if anyone disagrees with me, or I'm certainly open to hearing why Russia's invasion should be condemned, and especially I think we should talk about what are some actual examples of imperialism, and does that apply to Russia? I mean, and its operation in Ukraine. I mean, my understanding of imperialism was, for example, when the British Empire, the East India Company, went into India and burned down all the textile handlooms, destroying India's indigenous textile industry, forcing them to import all their cloth from Britain, and forcing a buyer monopoly on the cotton textile industry in India. Is that what Russia is doing in Eastern Ukraine? I don't see how that's what's going on. I don't see how that's imperialism. By helping these people who are not being allowed to secede from Kiev, that's imperialism. That's an invasion. Is what Russia's doing comparable to NAFTA going into Mexico and putting Mexican farmers out of business, who've been growing their own food for centuries, and forcing them to import food from U.S. agribusiness? Is that what Russia's doing in Ukraine? And in fact, quite the contrary. If you look in Ukraine, since Ukraine has been being pulled into the EU sphere of influence, there's actually a great recent article in Covert Action by an author whose name escapes me. I'm sorry, I don't have it in front of me, talking about the way that Ukraine, its grain supply is currently being looted by the United States. And on top of that, since 2014, since the Maidan coup, has been, they've been forcing Ukraine to use Monsanto's GMO seeds, frankenseeds, and there's a great article in CAM I would encourage everybody to read. I don't have it in front of me, but I think that constitutes imperialism more than anything Russia's doing. It's certainly, what Russia's doing in Ukraine certainly isn't comparable to African countries, the way that they export. They're so rich in resources, and while their valuable resources are being looted by ExxonMobil and BP and Shell and Chevron, where in African countries are rich in resources like oil, but the people in those countries remain poor and have high illiteracy and short life expectancy. I don't see how that's comparable to that's my understanding of imperialism. I don't see how that's what Russia's doing in Ukraine. And I think that that's exactly why when the vote was held at the UN to condemn Russia, the vast majority of the global South, in Africa, Latin America, most of those countries either abstained or voted against condemning it because they're not going to go along with the Western-led ostracization of Russia, and the reason that they did that is because Russia is not part of the imperial core. They are on the periphery. Russia still occupies the geopolitical space, despite the fact that, yes, post-Soviet Russia is capitalist. It still occupies the geopolitical space that was once occupied by the Soviet Union when it was assisting the movements for third world national liberation. This is precisely why Cuba, Nicaragua, much of the pink tide has sided with Russia or is choosing to, for example, as Lula da Silva did, at least say that Ukraine shares as much of the blame as Russia. Russia in the Nova-Russian republics, their businesses are not being colonized by Russian capital. Their products aren't being, Russia isn't forcefully importing their products. Russia is neutralizing the anti-Russian fascists, quite frankly, on the border who are terrorizing the mostly Russian-speaking people in Donbass and Eastern Ukraine. And again, it should be noted for 8 years, the Kremlin and Putin did not recognize those republics and only did so once the CPRF introduced the legislation. So finally, I just want to address, even when I think organizations like Workers' World and PSL take the stance that they have, which is certainly better than the two imperialisms camp, like I said, with Gödel's. I think ultimately it's US-NATO imperialism that benefits by condemning the invasion because, or even to say that when Russia, when the Crimean people voted 87% to secede and to join Russia, to call that annexation, I think ultimately, it's the US and NATO who benefit. We have, if we're going to be Marxist-Leninists, we have to a country can only be called imperialist or a military operation can only be called invasion if it meets all of the criteria that Lenin laid out. And I just think that if you look at the full, complete definition that Lenin gave of imperialism, not just the one that's given in Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, what's going on in Ukraine does not apply. I know I've been talking for an hour, so I should probably wrap it up, but I hope that wasn't too confusing. I tried to keep it as concise as I could, but this is actually the first lecture or presentation I've given, so I hope it was all right.
Thank you, Max. You did not disappoint. We really appreciate your taking the time to come and speak to us today, and I'm sure we're going to have a great discussion around a very important issue. So before we go into the question and answer part of today's presentation, I just would first ask people, if you have questions, you can raise your hand on Zoom by clicking on the reactions button on the lower right-hand corner of your Zoom window. We'll try to pick up people in the order in which their hands are raised. It's hard to kind of keep track of who's raising hands when. So if I make a mistake, please bear with me. We'll get everybody on to ask your questions. Before we get to the Q&A part, Oh, and again, we do want people to stick to the topic at hand as much as possible, and really let's keep this an open, spirited discussion with the with a common goal of trying to seek some truth about what's going on here. Before we get to that, let me just make a couple of quick announcements for the sake of time. Let me share my screen. We have a terrific couple of presentations coming up in the next few weeks. Next week, June 12th, we're going to have a presentation with Jack Rasmus, who's been writing a lot on the Ukraine crisis. He's a professor of political economy at St. Mary's College of California here in Moraga, very active political economist on the left. He's going to be speaking on US sanctions and the future of American empire. He's going to be talking about the impact of sanctions on the US economy, the role of sanctions and Russia, and the role of sanctions in the US Imperial project. So it's next Tuesday, the 5th at 10:30 a.m. The week following that, we're going to have a discussion and presentation on Roe versus Wade from Rosa Astra, and she is from the Party for Socialism and Liberation and a writer for Liberation News. So we actually have some things that are on tap for that. Something else I'd like to call to your attention is if you go to our website, icssmarks.org, in the upper right-hand corner, there's a donate to ICSS link. And there are several ways that you can do this by Patreon and PayPal. We do have expenses in putting this on in terms of our infrastructure and hopefully moving back into live on-site presentations at the Marxist Library in Oakland. So we would encourage you all to donate. Go to icssmarks.org and click on donate to ICSS for instructions on how to donate. Okay, with that being said, let's see, let's take a look at people who have raised their hands. And let me start with Janet, if you would please start, and then I'll get Norma, and then Raj, and then Jean. So Janet, if you would unmute yourself, let me enable allowing you to unmute. Hold on. And go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question, Janet. Thank you.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Max. It was an excellent presentation. I have a comment and several questions. My comment is that in order for to achieve Russia's denazification objective, Phase 3 of the special military operation may have to overthrow Zelensky. Okay, now my questions. First, there was a webinar this morning at 6 a.m. sponsored by the Ukraine Socialist Solidarity Campaign, featuring Michael Karagias speaking on Syria, Ukraine, geopolitics, and the working class. I didn't attend. He had been writing about Syria, now writing on Ukraine. In any case, the event description says he brings the same total opposition to Putin and supports the right of Ukraine to receive weapons from whatever source is available, regardless of the aims of those sending weapons, end quote. Would you comment on this? He's probably in camp 2, I don't know. Anyway, second, would you talk about imperialism as the acquisition of territory, whether for economic reasons or to protect the revolution? And how is settler colonialism related to imperialism, if it is? And then finally, you refer to NATO in the title of this talk. I don't think you referred to NATO during the talk. in April, investigative journalist and podcaster Asa Winstanley published a piece called NATO's Secret Nazi Armies. In it, he wrote, quote, "At the dawn of the first Cold War, the CIA and MI6 set about establishing a vast network of secret terror armies throughout Western Europe. Its foot soldiers were usually members of the far-right fascists, Nazi collaborators, extremist monarchists, and outright Nazis. This network was soon subsumed, coordinated through a NATO body, which at one stage took the rather unsubtle moniker of, quote, clandestine planning committee, end quote." And I'm continuing quoting him. I'm almost done. "Each country's secret army went by different, often obscure names, but the Italian branch was called Gladio, a reference to the double-edged sword, short sword used by gladiators during the Roman Empire. In 1990, Italian Prime Minister Giulio Andreotti revealed the existence of this secret army to Parliament. The network as a whole, therefore, came to be known as Operation Gladio. Would you comment on this and how it relates to your topic? Thank you."
Sure, yeah, I'll try and, hopefully I can remember all your questions. I'll try and address each point. As far as this talk that you said that you didn't attend, unfortunately, I'm not familiar with that author, but if you send it to me, I'm happy to take a look at it. However, I'm not even sure that he would fit into the second camp, because to my knowledge, even the Godels or the KKE or, many of the organizations that would say that what Russia is doing is imperialism and also NATO would qualify. I don't believe most of those organizations, to their credit, support sending weapons to Ukraine. I think, I don't want to mischaracterize their position. I mean, the only one you could say that, even the DSA, at least their international committees, they shouldn't be sending weapons to Ukraine, though I think it's really hypocritical that their elected officials like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Rashida Tlaib, and they voted all to send weapons to Ukraine. So,
And Bernie Sanders.
yes, of course. And how they can put out a statement like the one that they did and then turn around and vote for that, and without expelling them or punishing them in some sort of way or publicly rebuking them. I don't know how they get away with that. But as far as I know, any self-respecting Marxist organization, no matter what your position on this, whether you view the Russian operation as imperialism, if you claim to be an anti-war organization or anti-imperialist organization, you shouldn't be supporting sending weapons. So I'm not even sure that this particular individual would belong in that camp. That's just out. The only organizations I can think of or individuals who would be taking that position would be, the worst of the worst, like neoconservative Trotskyists, someone like the late Louis Proyect might say something like that, but as far as I know, they even the worst of them wouldn't be calling for sending arms. I think everyone is for some kind of peace agreement. As far as your other questions go, the relationship between you said colonialism and
Settler colonialism.
settler colonialism. Well, I do think that certainly, if you take a look at Saudi Arabia's war in Yemen or the Israeli occupation of Palestine, those certainly qualify as imperialism, especially when they serve the larger, if you look at the the relationship between, say, Saudi Arabia or Israel with Western imperialism, in addition to serving their own interests of conquering, of Saudi Arabia conquering Yemen or the Israeli occupation of Palestine, those are essentially imperialist created states. I mean, Saudi Arabia was created by the British, as was, the Zionist occupation was done with the British Empire.
It wasn't an occupation. It's a colonialization, the Zionist colonialization.
Sure. I mean, splitting hairs, but yes, I agree. If you look at the way, or even, you could say that many of Turkey's actions in Syria, for example, would constitute expansionism or imperialism. But my point was that the definition of imperialism does not denote necessarily just military action. It's an economic. The Marxist definition of imperialism versus the traditional or pre-industrial definition of imperialism, those are very distinct. The Marxist definition of imperialism represents an economic stage when a capitalist country has reached a certain point where it's overflowing with capital and it's having to export that capital, both, as Lenin laid out, through warfare and conquering, but also in times of peace through, for example, in Ukraine, when Zelensky was overthrown in the Maidan coup, it was because, in part, he had rejected, or excuse me, not Zelensky, Viktor Yanukovych was overthrown. He had rejected the European Union Association Agreement, which came with a huge austerity package that has now since been implemented by his successors after he was overthrown, Yanukovych, that included a huge austerity package, meaning privatization of utilities, wage and pension slashing, and all the rest of it, the privatization of transportation, everything. So it's the definition of imperialism is not limited to just simply warfare or conquering. It denotes an economic relationship. And so that was my point about that. Of course, there's there's a significant amount of interrelation between settler colonialism, like the Israeli, like the Zionist occupation of Palestine and the settlements and the expansion there. Of course, it's interrelated, but specifically my point was the Marxist definition denotes an economic relationship. And that's why I tried to show how in other works by Lenin, he expanded upon that definition where he divided the world into two camps, oppressor and oppressed nations. And as far as, can you remind me your other the other question?
The NATO reference.
Well, I was using, the United States and NATO. I think that term can really be used interchangeably because let's be honest, NATO is a US dominated coalition. These European leaders who are going along with, whether it's France or Germany, those are comprador governments. They're in many cases going against their own interests. I mean, Germany was all set to approve to begin the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline. And now the European economy is essentially being sacrificed with these sanctions on Russia for the interests of the United States. Who's going to benefit from, the severing of economic ties with Russia, but the United States, because now Germany is going to have to buy liquefied natural gas from the United States instead of getting it from Russia, which is much closer and cheaper to acquire it from. So when I said, if I didn't use NATO often enough, it's because I was using it interchangeably with the United States. And also, I just want to mention that I'm aware that the useful idiots quote or phrase that's attributed to Lenin. I'm aware there's no actual evidence that he ever said that. I just wanted to turn it around and use it on, the pseudo left, because that term has become so ubiquitous the way it's used. Anyone who during the whole Russiagate scandal, so many people who didn't buy into that were called Putin's useful idiots. So I just thought it would be funny to turn it around and use it on people who I think are not getting the Ukraine crisis accurately. But anyway, and as far as that, I'm not familiar with that specific article by Asa Winstanley, though I am familiar with some of his other work. I'll definitely take a look at it. In the article I wrote for CAM, I did talk significantly about how the Western intelligence agencies aided Nazi collaborators and former war criminals to undermine the Soviet Union and the guerrilla army there. And I'm also aware of Operation Gladio. I have Danielle Ganser's book, and I ordered actually another one recently, its name escapes me, but yeah, there's a terrific BBC documentary from the early 90s about Gladio. And I know that, that included far right groups in Turkey and throughout the European Union, where terrorist attacks that were committed by far right groups were blamed on left-wing organizations from Germany to Italy to Ireland and the UK. And yeah, I mean, that's the consequences, I think, of, the United States and NATO and their support of these far right groups in Ukraine, is because we're going to see blowback from that inevitably. And, the support for these far right groups throughout the Cold War, that has inevitable unintended consequences domestically or in Western Europe, where it's impossible to support that kind of thing abroad and not experience blowback back home. There was a great article in the Gray Zone recently about the concern about because Ukraine has many international volunteers, including from terrorist organizations, groups denoted by the FBI as terrorist organizations like Atomwaffen within the United States, who are, going abroad to volunteer to fight alongside the Azov Battalion and the Ukrainian Armed Forces. So that's the legacy of something like Operation Gladio. And the same goes for the West's support for international jihad. It's the same thing with you can't support that abroad for your own geopolitical interests to try and overthrow Gaddafi or Bashar al-Assad and not expect to experience some blowback of that in the United States or in Europe. And the same goes for these far-right fascist forces in Ukraine. You can't support something like that and give it a supply of weapons and not expect to have repercussions at home. So I think that's why it's so important to make that connection. So yeah, there's a great article in the Gray Zone, and I would say that's something like that's the legacy of Operation Gladio, using neo-Nazi groups to carry out your geopolitical objectives has serious repercussions at home.
Okay, so on the queue for questions are Norma, followed by Raj, followed by Jean. I would encourage folks to click on the reactions button, raise your hand, ask questions, make your comment. And with that, we'll go to Norma. Please ask your question.
Yeah, as a question. I have a comment. I think you would like to know what I wrote back to the community at large, wherever I could do it, Max. And that is, it took me a couple of days to figure this nonsense out. I haven't paid enough attention to the previous conflicts, Syria and so forth, and sort those out. But it became really apparent to me that what this attack on Russia is all about is that, and has been going on for 110 years, ever since Russia, the USSR, established the Bolshevik Revolution. And the insult, the constant invasion toward Russia, it's been relentless, as we know. And it's constant slap in the face, a constant dishonor of what the Soviet people put together that was so outstandingly glorious that it couldn't be tolerated by our owners. That's my comment, and that I wanted you to know. I did tell it to a lot of people, and then the result came the listing of the note by, I was surprised, John, what's his name, James Van, putting forward John Ryman's announcement. John Ryman is a very confused semi-leftist, put that note from Carl Davis, which is another confusion. How do those people get together to do this? To listen to the Karadzic presentation. So I can't get up at 6:30 in the morning and make any sense, so I didn't listen to it, but I'm reading what Karadzic wrote, so I'll know, so I'll stay on top of it. Do you know how to spell his name?
This is the same person that Janet was referring to.
Yeah,
earlier.
right.
I've heard the name, but I'm not.
Do you know how to look it up?
I'll post it. I'll post the name.
Are you going to use the chat at some time, Max?
Poor Matt, let's give him a chance.
I'm asking him,
Okay.
are you going to use the chat so that you can see the spelling of Karadish's name as Bill?
Sure, yeah, please. I'll like I said to Janet, I'll look into that, and please do.
Okay, because the chat ends with the ending of the meeting is why I asked him.
Yeah, I'll if you post it there, I'll copy and paste it elsewhere.
And of course, I'm very fond of your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
All right, next is Raj. Again, I want to encourage people to raise your hand, click on the reactions button if you have questions or comments. So Raj, go ahead.
I start with a comment, then move on to question. Okay, so first thing, I agree with you. I started out, mea culpa, I started out with two imperialisms description. And I thought because of Russia's agreement with China, unlimited friendship, that this is actually a rival imperialist camp. But I agree with you. I've come to understand it better. That was early stage, but I think it is more what you're saying is I agree with you substantially. So that's one thing I want to start out by saying. Other thing, I've read Greg Goodell's article, and I don't know if you noticed it. He describes the imperialism as a dynamic system. I don't know if you picked that up or not, where everybody plays their part, their tussles for going up the ladder, and some lose, some gain, that kind of stuff. That's a hodgepodge and an incorrect understanding of Lenin, diametrically opposed to Lenin. And I respect Greg Goodell generally, he writes well, but here he makes a terrible mistake, because Lenin describes it as a moribund situation when actually all his possibilities are exhausted, becomes monopoly capitalism, develops despotism, including a bribed section of the working class in imperialist centers. These are important concepts of Lenin he completely disregards. Now, if I were to look at Russia, certainly is capitalist. It does not. It is not in that situation. And as far as Russia's overseas direct investments are concerned, which is how you extract super profits from low wage countries, Russia is 1% of what US investments are overseas.
Even in Ukraine, I'm
Yeah.
sorry to interrupt you, but
No, go
even
ahead.
in Ukraine, Russia's foreign investments are pretty minimal.
Okay, so now I come with this question because some comrades who believe in two imperialism theory and they consider me as a person who has abandoned them, abandoned the good side of Marxism, Leninism.
Welcome
Are
to the club.
So they are saying, look, of the casualties that Max Parry says were 15,000 killed, and they actually criticize you, is actually only 3,400 are civilians, and 4,400 are Ukrainian forces, 6,500 are members of armed groups supported by Russia. Now, I have to say, UNCHR has a different number. So about 3,900 civilians. This is before start of this operation. So it's end of 21, and
Mhm.
4,200 Ukrainian, 1,500 Russian-backed militants. So the figures are all over, and I want you to kind of set the record straight. If did you make a mistake, or what is, or you didn't make a mistake? They are making a mistake. Could you please clarify?
I mean, in regard to the 14 or 1500 number, my understanding is that that's actually a low ball because those, as I said, those are UN statistics. There was a UN report put out. I don't have it right in front of me, unfortunately. Uh, and the vast majority, it certainly was more than, I don't know if it was the entire 1500, but the
You mean
vast majority,
15,000 or 1,500? 15,000, you mean?
15,000, excuse me. And the vast majority were said to be civilians. This did not include fighters or militants, or this was specifically addressing civilian casualties. And the vast majority were civilians within the DPR and the LPR. And polls have consistently shown that the majority of people who live in those areas support the secessionists, the separatists. They do not support the government in Kiev.
Good.
So this is that number. I mean, if it's inaccurate, they need to take it up with the UN, not me, because that's what I'm citing. I suppose it's possible that the number is inaccurate, but my estimation, based on the way that, let's be clear that the United Nations is a heavily politicized organization that typically favors the West, certainly not Russia. So my assumption would be that the 15,000 number would actually be a low ball and that it's actually possibly higher. So if I'm incorrect about that, I'm happy to look at whatever other figures they have, but that it was entirely based on civilians and not armed fighters.
If Alan would allow me pursue this just a little bit. Alan, do I have your permission?
Go ahead, Raj.
Just a follow-up. Okay, so take a look at those numbers. But what these people who are criticizing you don't say? I substantially agree with you that it is not. They also say these are basically Russians, Russian Nazi groups operating in Donbass, and that these people are the people who are fighting are paid for by the capitalists of Donbass, and they are their agents. So they are actually not genuine fighters. Now, I don't believe that, but if you have something I'd like to clarify, just one more thing. The actual casualties, which include injured, which should be included, are actually 44,000 according to.
Mhm.
So they ignore that. I think basically it is very clear that if they were Russian aid, Communist Party admits that they have sent some volunteers, but I've never heard of Russian Nazis fighting there. There might be some, I'm not excluding.
There are some Russian nationalists who have volunteered to fight in the conflict in Donbass, but they're vastly outnumbered by the DPR and LPR separatists are led by communists, and on top of that, they are the republics are self-declared socialist republics, and on top of that, even many of the international volunteers. There's actually a great documentary that I would recommend everybody to watch called A Sniper's War that came out a couple years ago. That's about a Serbian communist who personally lost a great number of his family with the NATO bombing of Yugoslavia, or NATO bombing of Serbia, and he actually it follows his services in the war in Donbass. He volunteers to go from Serbia to Donbass to fight against the Azov battalion and Ukrainian fascists. So a great deal of even the international volunteers are left-wing in their character. But no, my understanding is that the vast majority of the separatists are left-wing or socialist. There's a certain degree of maybe social conservatism, which I think a lot of the Western left would maybe say calls into question their political character. But I think, and yes, it is true that there are some Russian nationalists maybe or conservatives who have volunteered to fight alongside them as well. But I certainly haven't seen any evidence that there are outright neo-Nazis fighting in the DPR or LPR. And that's a pretty moot point when you consider the character of the many Ukrainian militias, whether it's Azov or Aidar or the Tornado Battalion. I mean, just look at the evidence when they've been captured by the Russian troops. I mean, they're covered head to toe in Nazi tattoos, and the way that they are not in terms of being volunteer militias, but officially incorporated into the Ukrainian National Guard. I mean, this is the equivalent of the Atomwaffen division, or all military. All armies throughout the world have far-rightists among them infiltrated, but the Ukrainian government officially incorporated the Azov battalion into their National Guard. This is open endorsement of neo-Nazi ideology. So if they're going to try and make any comparison between the right-wing, however minuscule there may be a right-wing character among the separatists, compared with Ukraine, it's just not even up for debate as far as I'm concerned. There's no comparison at all. Sure, because Russian nationalists, many of them are, because they're orientated towards Russia's interests, yeah, they might have some anti-imperialism characteristics or positions, but many of them, some of them may be volunteering to fight in Eastern Ukraine, but it just doesn't even begin to compare when you look at the character of those fighting on the Ukrainian side.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. I forgot to announce this during the break, but on July 3rd, we are going to have John Parker speak at our Sunday morning session, who recently visited the Donbass, toured the area, and he's going to give his eyewitness observations about what's going on there. And I think it's pretty clear from our conversation today that that's a real critical issue, and we're going to get a chance to hear from somebody on the left, a sympathizer, to see what he has to say. Next up is Dr. Rule, followed by Youssef. Dr. Gurzy, we have two.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Max, for this excellent talk. Very provocative, thought-provoking. And thank you, Alan, for working so hard to set all this up again. Excellent work. That being said, I have to say, first of all, I'm not one of those that thinks the best way to approach the problem is by quoting the 100-year-old work of Lenin. You know, that's important material. I like to quote Marx and Lenin as much as anybody, but I think the primary focus has to be on the analysis of what's actually going on. So I think that's where, as Marxist and Leninist, that's where I focus my work. Secondly, neither AOC nor the Squad nor Bernie are representatives of DSA. DSA may support them, but they are no way responsible to DSA, which is a good thing, I think. That being said, I'm also I think it's deplorable, the stance they have taken on the war in Ukraine, in Bernie's defense and their defense. They've never.
I'm aware that there's infighting within the organization. I'm aware.
Yes, I've been a member of DSA for half a century almost. So, but anyway, just to say that they are not representatives of DSA. And I should also just mention that I'm a supporter of PSL. I send them $25 a month. Also to Veterans for Peace, which I'm a member of. But the other thing, you know, I want to say, when this came up for a vote, there were 57 votes in the House against giving money to Ukraine. They were all Republicans. And when it went to the Senate, the only person that stalled it was Rand Paul. So I think it's a mistake to look to the Democrats for any kind of support. In fact, if you look at criticism of what's going on there, you have to look at Republicans, including Tucker Carlson and others that are very critical. That's important. We bear that in mind. At the same time, we have to bear in mind that when it comes to China, they're universally opposed, and they would go balls out for a war with China. So I think that's important. The other thing, the last thing I wanted to say, and get your opinion on this, is as a member of my criticism would be, well, what should the left position, what should our position be in terms of the war in Ukraine? And as I'm actually the president of the East Bay chapter of Veterans for Peace, and we disagree on certain issues with the national chapter. But for the East Bay chapter, our position is, first of all, bring our troops home. We shouldn't have any troops in Europe or Asia, nor Latin America for that matter. Old Smedley Butler, our totem person, has always said U.S. troops should stop at the border, basically. So that's one point. Secondly, no support. U.S. out of Ukraine and East Asia. No troops, no warships, nothing like that. And the third point is, again, I forget what the third point was, but I think everybody should really read the work put out by Putin and Xi Jinping, the joint statement they made, the 5,000-word statement about the solidarity. Because the first thing Putin did was the one to see his friend, Xi Jinping, and sat there, watched the Winter Olympics, and came out with this statement. So I think that deserves very careful scrutiny. So those are my comments, but it's just to say, what would be your recommendation? What should our position as Marxist-Leninists be towards the war in the Ukraine? Thank you. Again, thank you so much for this. It's excellent.
Thank you very much, Eugene. Well, first, your comment about the DSA and the PSL, for that matter. Yeah, I'm aware of the position of the group is I mean, first of all, it's a huge organization, the DSA. So inevitably, there's going to be a range of opinions among its members as to this particular conflict. I have a few friends who are in the DSA, so I'm aware that there's significant disagreement, and that there was, I actually touched on that in my article, that there was infighting or disagreement between local chapters and the international committee, the statement that they released. Actually, there was here in New York, sorry, there's a police car going by. I'm aware that Jamal Bowman, who initially opposed sending lethal aid to Ukraine, is now being primaried by an establishment Democrat who just appeared out of nowhere. He's facing a primary challenger, and I believe he defeated him, but who is a Kosovar Albanian who was fanatically pro-NATO, and denounced Bowman for being a member of the DSA because he, because of this statement put out by the International Committee, and Bowman, as a result, had to distance himself from the statement by the DSA International Committee, saying that he condemned Russia's invasion and so on and so forth. But anyway, so I'm aware of that. There's more a varying range of opinions within the group, and I know that just because AOC or Tlaib or whomever voted to send this latest lethal aid package doesn't necessarily mean that everyone in the DSA thinks that. My position was I'm very surprised that, or I just think that it's a problem that the organization isn't clear enough, or doesn't condemn these elected officials who are officially members when they take stances like this, because like in the case of Bowman, he seems to be eager to distance himself from the DSA when its international committee puts out a statement that gets him into hot water. So it's just sort of unclear, because there's constant divergence between the organization itself and then these politicians, who are supposedly members, who, there's a big divide between what the positions of the organization are and these elected officials in Congress who have political power, who are voting to send weapons. So that was my point there. And as far as the PSL goes, I actually, I have a great deal of respect for PSL and for the Beckers and the Answer Coalition and the work that they do. I just think that they, at least initially, when the operation began in February, really seemed to be caving into political pressure to condemn Russia's actions. And I have a feeling that they'll probably revise their position, and I know many people within the PSL and workers world who, I know what their real position is. I think that just publicly, the organization just seems to be taking this stance that is compromising. And I think the problem with that is that ultimately it makes the left look weak. If it doesn't dig in its heels and take a position that it actually believes, it ends up, it doesn't work. It's not gonna no matter what, the PSL and workers' world are going to be denounced as Putin apologists, no matter, even when they denounce Russia's so-called invasion. So as far as what I think the left should be doing, I think it should be taking honest stances. And if it doesn't think that the Russian military operation is an invasion, just say so. Stick to your guns. Because no matter what, I mean, even John Mearsheimer, a leading international relations scholar, he hasn't defended Russia's actions in Ukraine. All he's done is simply explain how NATO's expansion has served as a catalyst for Russia's action. You go read the Wall Street Journal's interview with him. This guy is the most qualified person there could be. He gets denounced as a Putin puppet. So no matter what you do, if you say anything that sounds even remotely like you sympathize with Russia's grievances, you're going to be called a Putin apologist. So I think it just makes the left look incredibly weak when it takes compromising positions like mostly denouncing NATO, but then turning around and saying, oh, well, we don't agree with Russia's decision to conduct this operation. I just think that, the left should take a more uncompromising stance. I'm not going to pretend like I have all the answers or that I know what the out and out position that the left should be taking. All I know is that it makes these organizations look incredibly weak when they take a compromising stance like that. I think, because it just doesn't work no matter what. The PSL is going to be branded, a pro-Russian organization, even when they have this qualification that they don't agree with Russia's decision to go into the Donbass. So that's what I hope that clarifies my.
What I'm going to do. Let's have Yusef next. Gene,
thank you. Well, I don't want to go into what, since I'm not a spokesman, I'm not in PSL or workers' world, I think they should answer your criticism. But in general, I think they have taken principled stances. However, I think it's this isn't unique that I'm excluding them definitely from what I'm going to say, is that ever since the war on Yugoslavia, and I dare say the first Gulf War, much of the left has given excuses, provided basically taken up the narrative of the imperialist camp, the left and the peace movement, but sort of qualified, well, we don't want war, which is, I think, a problem in the peace movement. And if you could care to elaborate on this past history, I want to make a few comments. Yes, definitely, Turkey's occupation of northern Syria and northern Iraq is at the behest of NATO and is imperialist. Although in Syria, the United States policy is somewhat divided, with some people feeling that the United States should use the Kurds in Syria, which have actually historically have been part of the left, but are problematic to say the least. Now, second, I'd like to acknowledge that today the anniversary of Israel's imperialist propelled aggression in 1967 and conquest and settlement. But could you please further elaborate on my question, which is sort of the past history of this left. And I would exclude PSL and workers' world. They have generally taken principled positions, and I'm not qualified to respond on their behalf today. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I definitely think we've seen this pattern before in previous conflicts. This certainly isn't the first time that, in my view, the left has failed to come up with an adequate response to, the outbreak of a geopolitical conflict. And it's certainly not the first time in regard to the proxy war, which has at this point several different theaters of war, proxy war between Russia and the West. I think we saw a similar failure in many respects in Syria with the positions that many organizations took, and also Libya. And I certainly think you could say the same thing going back to you mentioned the NATO war on Yugoslavia. There was a great deal of ideological disagreement over that conflict as well. And I think that this, particularly in regard to Ukraine, there's been a really, really unprecedented level of, I want to say, groupthink, and just, I have seen very few satisfactory statements put out accurately assessing what's going on there. I mean, the best one I've seen personally has been the Communist Party of Great Britain, Marxist-Leninists. I think that the statements that they've put out have been the best and most ideal characterizations of what's going on there. But I certainly would agree with you that this is part of a pattern, and it's not the first time that there's been, an insufficient response by the left or failure by the left. I know you said that you are excluding Workers' World and PSL, and I generally agree with those organizations, and I agree with much of the positions, that the courageous stances that they took on conflicts like Syria and Libya. And if you read their statements in regard to this current conflict, I think they get it mostly right. But I think that it seems to me like, at least recently, they felt the need to condemn Russia for its military operation. And again, if there's an argument to be made that Russia should not necessarily have gone in to Ukraine. But again, I would challenge anyone to put forth what they think Russia should have done instead, because I think that they, frankly, exhausted all possible options and really had no other choice. But I think Putin's back was against the wall, both by NATO and, domestically. The political opposition in the Communist Party had put a lot of pressure on him to recognize the sovereignty of the Novo-Russian republics. I think the crisis had reached a head where he had to make some kind of a move. And I think in the context of the disastrous US pullout from Afghanistan, he saw that, and also the ongoing infighting within NATO, as you mentioned, Turkey, it's infighting, it's butted heads with the United States over its support for the Kurds in Syria. The infighting involving France, where even Macron has put out statements calling NATO brain dead. And the fact that, the economic warfare on Russia has severe consequences for NATO member states like Germany and France. I think all of that, all of those factors was one of the motivations why Russia chose to go into Ukraine now as opposed to 8 years ago. I think the United States has overplayed its hand. Its military adventurism is extremely unpopular domestically. And the pullout from Afghanistan was so disastrous, where 20 years of war resulted in the Taliban retaking power. I think Russia looked at the current state of American hegemony and saw that now was the right time, if it was going to make any moves to push back against the expansion of NATO, now was the time. So again, if there was any possible alternative to what Russia could have done, I'm certainly open to hearing it, but I just don't see it as an invasion to be condemned. I see it as a defensive war that was inevitable against, NATO hostility, where you have 15 countries now in Russia's near abroad with missile systems pointed at. I mean, if the situation was the reverse, if there were Russian military bases on the Canadian and Mexican borders of the United States, I think we all know what the US's response would be. So I think at this point, Russia really didn't have any other choice. But in regards to your question, no, this is not the first time the left has failed. I think its poor response is just a culmination of many years of failure to get matters of world affairs correctly.
So we're a little bit past our time. I want to get Laura in, and then we'll ask Max to make a short closing comments. But Laura, if you would ask your question.
Okay, thank you. So thank you for the talk and the articles that you've written. For one thing, I would say about why people feel the need, people that you trust and respect, feel the need to say something about Russian invasion or need to say that they're opposed to the military action or whatever, is from my experience, it's not totally just what the powers that be want or what the powers that be might pull your plug and take away your platform, but it's the people who hear the constant drone of the lies. It's in order to have their ears not flap shut, that you'll say, and how I relate to that is that I had traveled a lot to Venezuela, and then I would run for office and I would want to talk about Venezuela. And the thing that I found I had to say, or if you talk about Cuba or whatever, this is talking to the general public, just trying to keep their ears open, is that of course it's not perfect. I would just say that right away. Of course it's not perfect, but here's what they're doing. And so that would be my, and I know like Amy Goodman, for example, she does a lot of good stuff, but she is already not everybody has even heard of Democracy Now! In the general public, but she's already on one side. She doesn't need to do anything to get her toward the left, but she needs to do something to keep her audience that's not so aware. And so I'm just saying that it is difficult to try to create that bridge, to people that have not studied this stuff. They don't know a whole lot of stuff. And I think, as I may have said before, I think there should be a word in the US called ignoration. We have education and we have ignoration. And what they're doing to us over and over is ignorating us. Not stupid, but ignorant. The other thing is that when you say, what could Russia have done? I'm no expert by any means, but I've heard that people say that possibly, rather than just rely on going to the UN or talking to the US or talking to, the other powers that be, talk to their customers, talk more to to Germany and more to France, and to try to keep those lines, and say, look, here's the situation, here's what's going to happen with the oil, with the energy, with all of our trade and things like that, to try to strengthen those ties. And I know this is not the same thing, but But there's something to be learned, I think, from Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, when he would always reach out to folks like Uribe, in Colombia, and other heads of state that were very much aligned with the US and not aligned with what Venezuela was doing, and even voting against Venezuela and stuff like that, was that he constantly wanted to talk to them. And the legacy that he has left is that there was a regional power, regional strength. And so again, I don't know how Russia and Europe, how could have, if there were any way that Putin, that the Russian government could have kept the lines, the leans, the cords stronger between other parts of Europe. And after that long statement, probably went over 2 minutes. The third thing is that I'll copy something into the chat about something that's happening in San Francisco on June 8th, which is next Wednesday, with 3 Venezuelan women who are going to be speaking in San Francisco. So thank you very much for the thought-provoking talk.
Okay, we're getting pretty late here. So Max, if you want to just take a couple minutes and closing remarks, that would be great. Then we'll stop the recording if people don't mind. And people stick around for a while. We usually stay on until about 1. It's off the recording, but we still have good discussion afterwards. So Max, would you just go ahead and give a brief closing statement?
Well, I mean, I can make a closing statement even in regard to what Laura just said.
Yeah.
I do think that we're already seeing that, I think even Putin's most fierce critics would acknowledge that, he's something of a diplomatic genius, if you ask me. I mean, in terms of, I think that we can see how Russia has kept the channels open. I mean, we're already seeing countries that said initially they were going to not trade in rubles for oil are in fact, while they're releasing official statements saying they're not going to, are already conceding that they're going to have to, both in the case of France, Germany, and several other EU and NATO member states. So I think the channels have been kept open. I think that's exactly why you see such a internal rift within NATO. Why it's even a possibility that France, a country like France, could eventually leave NATO as it did under de Gaulle back in the late 60s. And why you see the ascendancy of, unfortunately, some very right-wing, but anti-NATO candidates within EU member states. That's exactly why I think the left needs to come out harsher against NATO, because the right wing, the likes of someone like Marine Le Pen, is going to take the widespread anti-NATO sentiment amongst the populations of a country like France, who knows that when Macron goes along with the US's agenda against Russia, it's against their own economic interests. So that's why I think it's important that communist and socialist organizations within the imperial core, within the European Union, within the United States, recognize that these foreign policy decisions, these disastrous sanctions that the Biden administration has imposed on Russia are against the interests of the working classes within the imperial core here in the United States and in Western Europe. And that's why I think it's really important that the left takes a more uncompromising stance against the narrative itself being put out. Because when it doesn't, it's only lending tacit support to these policies. And that's why you have politicians from a supposedly socialist organization like the DSA ultimately going along with sending lethal aid to Ukraine. And that's why in my article, I as far as what Laura was saying about the importance of distancing oneself from Putin or saying that, no, of course, Russia under Putin is not perfect. That's why in my article, I did lay out criticisms of his, the historical inaccuracies that were in the speech he gave where he recognized the DPR and the LPR. I tried to lay out some of the disagreements. I certainly, don't support Putin and consider myself a communist, and I'm under no illusions that Putin is not a communist. But I do think the reason that he's fallen out of favor with the West is because he's not a puppet of the West. He's reversed many of the worst policies that were under Boris Yeltsin. And, I think I do understand the need, and I sympathize with why many organizations feel like they need to, make this qualification that, we're not in support necessarily of Putin. But I think when it comes to this conflict, this proxy war between NATO and Russia, it's really necessary that organizations take firmer stances and sort out some of these disagreements, because we're seeing the consequences for it here domestically. Just look at the damage that this is doing to the U.S. economy, and who's suffering the consequences. It's not the ruling class here. It's people who live in the imperial core, the people who are having to deal with the inflation, the high gas prices, and all the rest of it. So I just want to thank the Icss and Alan, for inviting me, because this is exactly what I wanted to have happen when I wrote my article, was, a debate, a dialogue, because I think as time goes on, the people are going to really start to come around and see how, arming Ukraine and making sure that Ukraine joins the EU and NATO is not worth sacrificing the entire world economy, in addition to, unfortunately, all the millions of Ukrainians that are affected by this. So that was exactly my intention when I wrote the article, was to hopefully have something like this happen. And so thank you for being the first to invite me and have a great discussion. I hope my lecture was, it's the first time I've ever talked for this long, so I hope I know it was probably a little scatterbrained, but I tried to keep it as clear as possible. So thank you for listening, and thank you for inviting me. It was really a great opportunity.
Max, that was a great presentation. We're going to invite you to come back again. Please don't forget about us when you become famous. I would say rich and famous, but I don't think you'll become rich by doing this. But
no, I've got a day job, just like I'm sure like all the rest of you do. I'm not doing this for the money. If I wanted to make money doing journalism, I'd be trying to have a bigger
you
social
definitely
media.
have your feet on the ground on that question. So what we're going to do now, we're going to stop the recording.
Institute for the Critical Study of Society at the Nebel Proctor Marxist Library receives no corporate funding, nor do we have any paid staff. We rely on the support of working class folks that share our commitment to the socialist legacy of Karl Marx. We continue to need funds to meet necessary expenses. Since we can no longer pass the hat at our in-person forums, please send contributions to our treasurer, either online via PayPal or by check. The PayPal ID is ICSS Sunday, SUNDAY, @yahoo.com, and the name is Richard Fallenbaum. and checks may be made out to Richard Fallenbaum and sent to him at 1225 Nielsen Street, Berkeley, California, 94706. Fallenbaum is spelled Fallenbaum. To donate directly to the Marxist Library, send a check to the Nebel Proctor Marxist Library at 6501 Telegraph Avenue, Oakland, California, 94609, or directly or donate online at www.paypal.me/npml. For information, write to npml at marxistlibr.org, and the website is marxistlibr.org.